research has shown that when it comes to strength, you can stay well away from failure and still get quite strong. If you have questions, please feel free to email us, podcast@verse.fit. Otherwise, you can comment below or just like our podcast. Welcome to the Verse Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Robert. I'm the head product designer here at Verse, and I've been a personal trainer for about 20 years. Today's podcast, I wanted to talk about something that came up at the gym, actually. I was talking with one of the members, and they asked, what's the best system they should use? They felt really confused by all the information that's out there. High reps, low reps, progression this way, progression that way. There's so many different things, and I'll admit that I'm probably just as guilty as anyone else at making this stuff more complicated than it needs to be. If you're kind of a nerd for this stuff, as I am and most trainers are, it's really fun. It's really fascinating to play around with different variables and see what kind of effect that can or can't have on your training. The information we put out, though interesting to us, I can understand how it might be confusing to someone who isn't as deep into all this training and fitness stuff as we are. But it did get me thinking about probably one of my favorite forms of progression. I say progression rather than periodization because it's not exactly periodization in the traditional sense of that definition. In this case, what I'm talking about is what used to be known as the double and sometimes triple progression. The difference between the double and the triple we'll go over in a little bit. It also kind of varied from author to author. But the basic premise is what people in the kettlebell community would call mastering a weight. It involves taking a movement and a specific weight for that movement and accumulating volume over time, relatively slow before adding weight. 100 years ago, if you were to get into barbell training or weight training, you would have probably bought some kind of barbell set or loadable dumbbell and gotten a little booklet that would come with a whole series of exercises. It would say course number 1, and it would be 6 to 10 exercises. And you would go through each of these exercises and you would probably just do one set of those exercises, and that would be that course. There may be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 courses that come in there. And the idea is you take a weight and do one set of 6 reps. Then the next workout you would come in and you would do that exercise and you would do 7 reps with the same weight. This was the York barbell system. It was known as the progressive system, and each workout, which was probably 3 a week, very common recommendation for a long time, you would add 1 rep. Of course, being York barbell and very hyperbolic, they claim to have invented this. I know for a fact they didn't, because this kind of system has been around for a long time. Variations of this system that are even more refined and much smarter have been around since before York barbell was around. They came out with their double progressive system, which is not that different. The only change is you would stick with the same weight for 2 workouts before changing to another rep. So going from 6 to 7 would be 2 workouts. That 3rd workout, you're increasing up to the 7th rep. Depending on the exercise, you would stick with this same weight until you got to 10, 11, 12, 15, maybe 20 reps, depending on the exercise. Then you would lower back down to 6 and increase the weight. I've talked about this system briefly in some of the podcasts, and I've written about it in blog posts, but I think it's worth spending more time and going into greater detail because it really is such a simple but really great system. It covers so many important bases that can get lost in trying to think about modern training. The first real recorded instance we have of this training probably comes from who many people have called the father of modern athletics, or at least people in the former Eastern Bloc of Europe would know him as that. His name was Dr. Vladislav von Krajewski. He was the founder of the St. Petersburg Athletic and Cycling Club, as well as a physician to the Tsars of Russia. He was born in Poland, and in addition to the Athletic and Cycling Club, founded the St. Petersburg Amateur Weightlifting Society in 1885. With his knowledge in medicine, physiology, psychology, and extensive experience in physical culture, he was very popular and much sought after trainer, or at that time, professor of physical culture in that part of the world. There were very few strongmen, performers, or athletes in Europe who didn't spend some time learning from him, or at the very least, benefiting from his knowledge that other people had learned from. Much in the same way that a modern person who's a trainer might be using things that they learned that were espoused by Louis Simmons of Westside Barbell or Pavel Tsatsouline of, well, now Strong First, but originally Dragon Door, the probably godfather of kettlebells. His most famous pupil was the Estonian wrestler George Hackenschmidt, who was a world champion wrestler, world record breaking weightlifter in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. He wrote a book called The Way to Live, which came out in 1908. So this is far earlier than York Barbell was around. Keep that in mind when it comes to who originated some of this stuff. In that book, Hackenschmidt talks about how one should train. And he espouses a double progressive system that he says he learned from Krajewski, his trainer. So we know that Krajewski was using it at least in the 1880s, if not before that. Who he learned it from, hard to say, probably some circus strongman or something. But it's been around for a long, long time. And the way that it was done 100 plus years ago is still a great way. In The Way to Live, Hackenschmidt says that you should basically take a weight that you can do for 10 reps with maximum effort. So what we would in today's parlance call a 10 rep max. This is a true 10 rep max. You couldn't possibly do 11 reps with good form, obviously. That's always the caveat, with good form. And he says do 5 reps with that weight. So you're doing about half the amount of reps you're capable of. In his program, you're working out 3 days a week. Again, very popular for most of the early days of weight training. Again, probably just one set, but every week is when you're going to increase the rep. So the first week you're doing all your sets are 5. The second week, all your sets are 6. And it's going to follow in this pattern until you do all your sets with 10 reps for most exercises. Some exercises had you go up to 20, but for the most part, it's 5 reps to 10 reps. This is about a 6-week time period that's going to elapse before you would then lower back down to 5 reps, add some weight to the bar. How much weight? For smaller movements like arm exercises, probably 5 pounds. For bigger movements like legs, he says 10. I think that's really going to vary from person to person, but as a beginner point, that's not a bad recommendation. In fact, that's a recommendation you still see applied to modern training programs. If you look at something like Jim Wendler's 531, that's what he has you do after the 3-week wave. When you cycle back, you add 5 pounds to upper body lifts, 10 pounds to lower body lifts. Getting back to Hackenschmidt, you have this 6 weeks go by and you add a little load and repeat the process. If you just look at this on paper, it goes, okay, yeah, sure, that makes sense. It's very simple. But just because it's simple doesn't mean it isn't really effective and elegant. And particularly what I'm talking about is modern strength research has shown that when it comes to strength, hypertrophy is a little different, but strength, you can stay well away from failure and still get quite strong. This is something that the Soviet weightlifting system of the mid to latter part of the 20th century espoused, and they certainly produced their fair share of very strong lifters. Their philosophy was doing about 1/3 to 2/3 of maximum rep ability per set. So again, that's very far away from failure. If you're taking this 10 rep max, that would be doing 3 to 6 reps. 5 is right in the middle. It's in line with that philosophy. And you're spending a lot of time practicing this movement before you're trying to increase any sort of stress done with that movement. So you're going to do 3 workouts doing half the amount of reps you're capable of. Then you're going to spend 3 workouts doing 2/3 of the amount of reps you're capable of doing. And you're going to carry on in this way. By the time you're at that 6th week and doing 10 reps, you've mastered this weight and you're very comfortable. And that's no longer a 10 rep max because you're so much more efficient with it. So where 6 weeks ago, those 10 reps were maximum effort, now they're like, I don't know, a 7, a 6, or a 7 out of 10 effort. Like you're much, much stronger. And so you're still, the effort you're putting forth is still in line with that lower intensity effort, that like 1/3 to 2/3. But it's also following a very slow increase training load. That is key in any training program. It's best summed up by former weightlifter great Yuri Vlasov. If you don't know Vlav, you should. He was an amazing lifter in his own right. Starting in the mid to late 1950s, he lifted for the former Soviet Union, winning gold at the Olympics in 1960 and silver in 1964. Unfortunately, to win that gold, my bias being an American, unfortunately, to win that gold in the 1960 Olympics, he had to beat Americans Jim Bradford and Norbert Szymanski, who took second and third respectively. Still an amazing performance. He was the first man to snatch 200 kilos, I believe, or clean 200 kilos. In addition to winning the Olympics, gold and silver at the Olympics, he won 6 golds at European weightlifting championships, I think 4 or 5 golds at world weightlifting championships. He was also one of the inspirations for Arnold Schwarzenegger to take up serious strength training. This is a guy who had legitimate street cred as well as a lot of knowledge when it came to training, and he is quoted as saying, "An increase in the volume of training loads leads to long-term structural and functional changes in the organism. It builds a foundation for increasing strength, and as strength increases at the same time, but not too much," I'm going to take that again, Ambrose, if you can edit this out. Vlasov said, "An increase in the volume of training loads leads to long-term structural and functional changes in the organism, builds a foundation for increasing. Of course, strength grows at the same time, but not too much. Then an increase in intensity assures a quick conquest of new results. But by itself, intensity does not produce deep adaptive responses." So what is he saying here? As much as something like coming in and doing balls to the wall, maximum effort is fun, trust me, I love it, it doesn't actually build long-lasting strength. It will build strength, but it doesn't last very long. The thing that builds strength is slowly building the total amount of work done over time. We can accomplish that through sets, reps, load on the bar, etc., all these things, but we need to coax our body into long-term structural changes. That's bigger muscles, bigger tendons and ligaments, stronger tendons and ligaments, all these kinds of things, a more efficient nervous system. And then once we've built that load over time, we can transition into those heavy singles to express that strength. As we raise our floor training load, our ceiling will get higher when we reach for it. But simply reaching for the ceiling without raising the floor is not going to get you there faster. So using something like Hackenschmidt system really efficiently raises your floor. It slowly coaxes that training load up and creates those structural changes we want. Now, I can appreciate just looking at this system that Hackenschmidt espoused and say, that's not appropriate for me. 3 sets a week, that's not enough. I get it. I understand what you're saying. It's definitely not enough for an intermediate or advanced lifter, but that doesn't mean that that's where this system ends. There's a ton of utility just taking this core concept and applying it to other programs. In fact, a lot of other really famous programs have. If you've ever heard of the Hepburn method, named for Canadian strongman, Olympic champion Doug Hepburn, it is essentially this system. Actually, it's what would be called the triple progressive system because it progresses in reps, sets, and then weight. So you're hitting 2 fronts of that. And that system, a lot of people have had great success with it. And it's so simple. It's slowly raising that training load over time to let your organism adapt to what you're trying to get it to do, which is be stronger. So that system, if you're not familiar, is you start with 8 sets of 2. You're going to work out twice a week. The first workout, you're going to do 8 sets of 2. And you're probably starting with a weight you can do about 6 reps with. So again, we're in that 1/3 to 2/3 kind of range. 8 sets of 2, workout 1. Workout 2, 1 set of 3, 7 sets of 2. The next week, you're going to do workout 3, and it's going to be 2 sets of 3 and 6 sets of 2. I think you can see how this pattern starts to emerge, and slowly over time, you're building up to 8 sets of 3. Now, I've seen other variations of this where you focus on building up just that 1 set at a time. So your third workout would be 1 set of 4 and then 7 sets of 2. And then it'd be a set of 5 and 7 sets of 2. I suppose that could work too. People have had success with that. I like the original, the one that I laid out. That's what I have understood as the Hepburn method. That's what he wrote about in his writing. So I'm going to go with the original source, the man himself. Then you'd follow that up for a little bit more hypertrophy with 3 sets of 6, slowly progressing up to 3 sets of 8 to 10, depending on how high you want to go, but probably 8. Again, this system is slow and allows your body to adapt. You get very efficient at the movement. Your neurological adaptations are incredibly high. You allow your body to adapt to this volume. You truly master the weights, so that by the time you're doing those 8 sets of 3, they're crisp, they're sharp, you're really putting force into the bar. Now you're ready to add some load. By going just a couple reps at a time, you're also going a couple sets at a time, you're taking even longer. So it's not forcing your body to adapt the way a lot of people want to do. Say, oh, I'm going to make myself do 5 more pounds this week. I'm going to make it happen. You're giving an overload because you're doing that one extra rep. If you go back to our first podcast about progressive overload, that counts. That's more work than you did the time previous. But it's so small and so subtle that your body can handle it, especially because you didn't start at your max. You're slowly then increasing the amount of sets that you're doing this amount of reps with as well. So it's not just, okay, I'm doing reps. Now I'm reps. And then here's another set of that rep. And then here's another set of that rep. And you're slowly building reps and then sets and then reps and then sets. So that's the triple progression. And a lot of people will hear this and go, oh my God, that takes so long. And it does take longer than simply adding a little bit of load each week. However, it's one of those classic tortoise in the hare situations, or people overestimate how much they can do in the short term and underestimate how much they can do in the long term. So over the course of a year, you're going to get so much progress from something like this. And over the course of 5 years, the progress is going to be ridiculous. And again, as I talked about in some of the previous podcasts, with all weight training programs, you need to think long term. And long term is not 12 weeks, 16 weeks, even a year, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. Think, what can you do if you follow these systems logically and concurrent, like for that period of time? You can make incredible progress and do so without suffering a lot of injuries because you're allowing your body to adapt to that training load. There's other ways to set this up. If you've ever heard of the Russian squat routine, which comes from the 1976 weightlifting yearbook, it was a squat program that the Russian weightlifting team may or may not have done. I've heard debate on both sides. Some of this stuff they would just put out there and say, yes, this will work, without ever having done it. In my experience, it does work. Fred Hatfield, Dr. Squat, wrote about it in his book, Power, as a very great program, and I think it also works. Now, it is a little bit faster of a progression, and probably that's because it was designed for athletes who were using PE. Olympic weightlifting in this era was notorious for PED use, but that doesn't change the fact that it's still an effective program, and it is straight double progression. It's very simple. It's a 6-week program where you take 80% of your max and you do 6 sets of 2 on workout 1, 6 sets of 3 on workout 2, back to 6 sets of 2 on workout 3. That's week 1, 3 days a week. Week 2, you're going to go 6 sets of 4, 6 sets of 2 again, 6 sets of 5. Week 3 is 6 sets of 2, 6 sets of 6, 6 sets of 2. That's your first 3-week block. That's all with 80% load. Probably most people can do between 6 and 10 reps with an 80% weight to begin with. So you're starting on that low side and building up to 6 sets of 6. Now, don't get me wrong. I've done this program a handful of times, and although successful, it is very hard. That 6 sets of 6 with 80% is a tough workout. And then the following week, you're going to go 5 sets of 5 with 85, which is doable, but again, hard. 6 sets of 2 again at 80. So that's, by that point, this is an easy workout. This is like, you can do this in your sleep. 4 sets of 4 at 90. Tough. Very tough. 6 sets of 2, 3 sets of 3 at 95. Damn. 6 sets of 2, and then you finish up with 2 sets of 2 at 100%. And then you can go for a max. It's a hard, very hard program. It's worked for a lot of people. I've had success with it. I've had clients use it successfully. But let's not get lost in that. The point is, this is straight double progression. This is 1976. The Soviet sports scientists are writing about this, still using this double progression as a very effective mode of training. If you look around, especially in that era prior to the 80s and the 90s, you'd see this in a lot of places. One very influential writer from this era was named Anthony DiTillo, and he would use this system in almost all of his training programs. He would often have you say, do 4 sets of 5 to 7. Start with 5 and build yourself up to 7 reps. When you can do 7, drop the weight load. Very common recommendation. But he also would get more specific. A lot of this was influenced by his mentor, a Hungarian former weightlifter named Dezo Ban that he trained with at his gym somewhere in Pennsylvania outside of Pittsburgh. And Dezo's theory of training lies in the assertion that the body will adapt to most any stress as long as enough time is given for it to adapt to the workload. In other words, if you allow the body sufficient time to adjust to a certain load, you will recover and actually become capable of even more work and heavier work when the adaptation takes place. So all that means is slowly the training load to increase, your body will adapt to that. You can do more work with that same load and or more load. And I think DiTillo summed this up really well in one of his articles about this when he talked about how Dezo trained. The article is called Strength Training Without Steroids. And I'm going to take a quote from here because I think it sums it up perfectly. He says, "Let us say you can squat 400 for 1. Let us also assume that you can get 350 for 2 or 3 sets of 5 repetitions. Caveat. In my experience, that would be a bit of a stretch. Someone who has a 400-pound squat for a single, like a hard single, 350 for a couple sets of 5 would be, that's a pretty tough workout. That's 88% of a max or something. So that's a stretch, but don't lose sight of the overall message. Let's not focus on the numbers. Okay, I'll start over. Let us say you can squat 400 for 1. Let us also assume that you can get 350 for 2 or 3 sets of 5 repetitions. Now suppose you never go above 350, but systematically work at getting more work done with this weight as time goes by, until you're getting 3 sets of 5 with 350 and then 2 or 3 sets of 3 with the same weight. Perhaps a few weeks or a month or 2 goes by, and now you're able to get 350 for 5 or 6 sets of 5, along with a few sets of 3s. Do you think you're any stronger than when you started? You surely are! Exclamation, exclamation. And if you decided to peek out for a few weeks and see how much you could squat for a single, I am sure that you would go far above the 400 for 1 with which you started this program. And I think that illustrates perfectly what we're talking. You're increasing the training load with the same weight, mastering that weight, becoming very efficient with it, letting your body adapt and build all of the necessary structures it needs to get strong. Then just a short period of time to peak that out, and you can prove how much stronger you are. Maybe he's taking it a little far, and in fact, when you look at the programs that he says to go along with training like Dezo, it says to do 7 sets. And when you can do 7 sets of 5 with a given weight, it's time to change it. Keep that in mind. He's going maybe a little hyperbolic here by saying you end up doing 15 sets of 5 or whatever. But the point remains, you can increase the reps as we've done in some of these other programs. You can increase the sets, which seems to be more of what he's doing here. Although if you listen again, he's saying increasing both, very similar to the way Hepburn did. We're saying, okay, you're going to do 2 or 3 sets of 5, and then maybe you'll do a few sets of 3s, and then eventually you're going to build up to doing multiple 5 or 6 sets of 5, and then a few sets of 3s or 2s. He's doing both. In the actual program he lays out, it stays pretty static with the 7, which brings up an important point. These rep ranges aren't necessarily locked. You could go 5 to 10. You could go 10 to 20. You could make it smaller, 5 to 7. In this case, like 3 to 5. That's a great one. That's really strength oriented. You could even do this as singles, not max singles. Remember, all of this is predicated on the idea that you're training below your maximum ability to allow your body to accumulate the training load that it needs and adapt in the way that you need to. But you could do it as singles. So let's say you take maybe 90% of a max, and this week you do 3 singles with it. And over the training weeks, you build that up to 10 or 12 singles. You're going to be way stronger by doing that. You're more likely to reach some kind of stale point or burnout because you're so consistently working with 90% or more weights. So that's a type of program that I don't think you can do as long term as some of these other programs where you could run indefinitely. Something like a Hepburn method or inspiration from Hackenschmidt, like going from 5 to 10 reps. But this would be a great transition if you're going off of one of those programs to trying to peak out. You go, okay, I built up and I've done 7 sets of 5 or 8 sets of 3 for the last, let's say, 30 weeks. So now I'm going to take a block of 6 to 10 weeks of doing these singles at 90 or whatever you decide to start at and build that up. And then you could take 2 or 3 weeks where the volume drops a lot. Say instead of doing 10 singles, which you've done at the end, now you're going to do 2 or 3 for a week at 95, 97. Then you're going to do 1 or 2 at 100%-ish. And then finally you test for a max. That could be very effective as well. I wouldn't jump straight to that one. Ask me how I know, because I did, and it's not a great one to start with. You need to let your body adapt to this style of training a little bit before you can do that. But once you have, it's totally valid. The whole point here is however you set this up, it's such a long-term plan that even an advanced lifter could run this style of training for basically their whole training career. Beginner, intermediate, advanced, they all could benefit from this. The beginner, I wouldn't recommend starting with 3 reps. You're not efficient enough. But 5, in that Hackenschmidt recommendation of starting with a 10 rep max, doing 5 reps and building up, really great. A more advanced lifter, you could start with pretty heavy 3s. It should be a weight that's like maybe a 6 rep max or something like that, so that you can make sure all of your reps are performed with ideal technique, very explosive, crisp, all those things that you want to see. And you could just carry this on and make progress slowly, but basically indefinitely. There's even ways you could combine this with some other styles of training that involve waiving the loads, but keeping the idea of this double progression. I'm not going to get into that because it's much more advanced than this discussion needs to be. The core concepts of this double and triple progression are so solid that you could make it seem more advanced when really it's just the same thing stretched out over time. So to go back to the original inspiration behind this podcast, if someone were to ask me, what should I do in the gym because I'm confused about what the best way to train is, and this person says this and that person says that and no one seems to agree, I honestly think this is probably the answer, because you can do this forever and make really great progress, very low risk of hurting yourself. Modern sports research is backing up more and more just how true this style of training is. It allows you to get stronger. It will build muscle, all these things. To anyone who might be confused, really consider looking into this system. I hope I did a good job covering it so that you understand it. But if I didn't, there's a lot of great resources out there. You can look up Anthony DiTillo. He has some books that you can buy. I think the website is superstrengthtrainingbooks.com or something like that. But I'm sure if you just Google Anthony DiTillo books or something, it would come up. You can read George Hackenschmidt's book. I'm pretty sure it's free because it's from 1908, so it doesn't have any copyrights. You can find the Russian squat routine online. If you just search that, there's calculators all over the place. The Hepburn method, again, online. If you just search Hepburn method, it'll come up. There's tons of resources out there if you need more information about it. Otherwise, really consider giving it a try. Again, I'm Shane Robert. This is the Verse Fitness Podcast. If you have questions, please feel free to email us, podcast@versefit. Otherwise, you can comment below or just like our podcast.